Welcome to Crime Documentary, the place where the darkest moments of history are retold with chilling detail and raw truth. Tonight, we take you back to November 13th, 2015, a night that forever changed Paris and sent shockwaves across the world. It began like any ordinary Friday evening, filled with laughter, music, and life. But within hours, the City of Light was drowned in blood and terror. Coordinated attacks across restaurants, stadiums, and concert halls turned joy into chaos, leaving the world asking one haunting question: how could such horror unfold in the heart of Europe? The night of November 13th, 2015, began like any other in the bustling heart of Paris. The streets were alive with the sound of footsteps, laughter, and conversations as friends gathered for dinner. Families strolled under the glowing streetlights, and tourists soaked in the beauty of the city, known as the City of Light. At the Stade de France, thousands of fans filled the seats, buzzing with excitement for the friendly football match between France and Germany. Security was tight as usual for a game of that magnitude, but nothing seemed out of place, nothing to suggest the chaos that was silently building in the shadows. Inside the stadium, cheers and chants echoed, the pitch glowed under the bright floodlights, and the players ran with energy and pride. Outside the gates, however, figures moved with deadly intent, their steps heavy, not with joy but with mission. Hidden beneath coats and strapped tightly to their bodies were explosives that would soon shatter the illusion of safety. At 9:20 p.m., the first explosion ripped through the air. The ground shook, and people closest to the gates froze in horror, their faces lit by fire and debris. At first, many inside the stadium thought it might have been fireworks, a celebratory noise mistaken in the midst of the game, but the truth became clear almost instantly for those near the blast. Security officials rushed to the site, their radios crackling with panic, their eyes scanning for the source of the destruction. As confusion spread, the football match continued, a decision made to prevent mass panic within the packed stadium. Fans remained mostly unaware of the true danger outside, though unease spread quickly as whispers of an explosion grew louder. Within minutes, a second blast echoed from another entrance, louder, closer, unmistakably violent. Spectators turned, their heads, murmurs rippling through the crowd as players looked toward the stands, unsure of what was unfolding. French President François Hollande, who had been attending the match, was quickly escorted out by his security team, his exit hidden from the public eye as the possibility of a large-scale attack began to sink in. In the city center, far from the stadium, Parisians were enjoying the kind of night they had always cherished. Cafés overflowed with customers savoring wine and dinner, streets pulsed with energy, and music from bars and restaurants filled the air. It was a night of normalcy that would never return. Around 9:25 p.m., just as emergency services were still rushing to respond to the explosions at the stadium, armed men arrived at Le Carillon Bar and Le Petit Cambodge restaurant. Without hesitation, they opened fire on diners sitting at tables, laughing, drinking, and unaware that their last moments had arrived. Glass shattered, chairs overturned, and screams pierced the air as bullets tore through the lively crowd. The gunmen moved with chilling precision, reloading calmly, firing again, targeting anyone who moved. Survivors dove beneath tables, pressed themselves against walls, and clutched strangers for comfort. A street that had been filled with conversation seconds earlier was now soaked in blood and fear. In another part of the city, at La Belle Equipe Café, gunmen repeated the nightmare. Again, laughter turned to screams, wine glasses shattered, and lives ended without warning. The attackers were coordinated, each strike timed to maximize confusion and terror. In less than 30 minutes, multiple locations across Paris were transformed into war zones. Back at the stadium, chaos was spreading. People had begun to realize that what was happening outside was not an accident, not fireworks, but deliberate attacks. Panic set in as another blast thundered near the stadium's perimeter. Security forces locked down the entrances, unsure if more attackers were waiting inside the stands, while terrified fans scrambled to reach safety. On the pitch, players tried to maintain composure as officials debated whether to halt the match, the weight of the situation pressing down on everyone. Helicopters hovered above, sirens wailed in every direction, and Paris was suddenly a city under siege. For those in restaurants and bars across the city, the nightmare unfolded in waves. Sirens grew louder, cell phones buzzed with messages of warning, and social media exploded with posts from terrified citizens trying to make sense of what was happening. Some thought it was a single shooting, others a bomb. But soon the truth became undeniable. It was coordinated. It was planned, and it was spreading across the city with brutal speed. Parents clutched their children, couples hid in kitchens and basements, and strangers huddled together, bound by the same fear. Police and medical teams rushed from one location to another, overwhelmed by the scale of destruction, their radios filled with overlapping reports of shootings, explosions, and bodies lying in the streets. In those first chaotic hours, Paris felt like a city in the grip of war. The attackers moved methodically, hitting one location, then another, never staying long, but leaving behind devastation each time. Witnesses described the horror in broken voice, people falling without warning, the staccato of gunfire echoing down narrow streets, the sight of lifeless bodies sprawled across cafe terraces. Ambulances struggled to navigate through the traffic and chaos, their sirens drowned out by the sound of fear itself. Yet, as terrifying as it already was, Paris had not yet faced the deadliest chapter of that night. The city was bleeding, the stadium shaken, the cafes destroyed, but the most horrific attack was still waiting to strike. And it would come from a place no one expected, a concert hall filled with music, joy, and young lives unaware of the darkness already consuming their city. The Bataclan concert hall was a symbol of Parisian nightlife, a place where music and art had thrived for decades. On the night of November 13, 2015, it pulsed with energy as fans gathered for a sold-out show by the American rock band Eagles. Of death metal, laughter, cheers, and the strumming of guitars filled the air, and for a moment, the city outside seemed far away. Inside, people were lost in the music, clapping and singing along, unaware that terror was closing in. Outside the venue, shadows moved with deadly purpose. The attackers had already struck multiple locations across Paris, and now their focus had turned to the Bataclan. Armed and determined, they approached the entrance, blending into the crowd of fans. No one suspected that behind the smiling faces of concertgoers, a nightmare was about to unfold. At approximately 9:40 p.m., the first shots rang out. Confusion spread immediately as the sound of gunfire cut through the music. Some in the audience thought it was part of a show or fireworks, but the realization came quickly and violently. Panic erupted as people scrambled to escape. The attackers pushed through the doors, their faces covered, weapons ready, and intentions clear. Inside, chaos became instantaneous. The crowd surged toward exits, pushing and falling over one another in terror. Those nearest to the gunmen were struck first, their screams piercing the air as the music was replaced by the relentless rattle of bullets. Every corner of the venue became a trap, every doorway a potential point of death. The attackers moved with methodical cruelty. They fired into the crowd with no hesitation, targeting anyone who ran, screamed, or even looked at them. The Bataclan, once a place of joy and music, became a slaughterhouse in minutes. Hostages were forced to the ground, their faces pressed against floors or walls, as the gunmen reloaded and shouted orders. The smell of gunpowder and blood filled the air, mingling with the screams and sobs of the innocent. Some tried to hide beneath seats, others behind pillars, while a few, in desperate courage, attempted to flee toward exits only to be met with more gunfire. The attackers were relentless, and every second that passed felt like an eternity to those trapped inside. Outside, news of the shooting spread almost immediately, creating an atmosphere of mass panic. Parisians took to social media, their messages, desperate pleas for information, safety, and confirmation from loved ones. Reports of gunfire and casualties at the Bataclan came in alongside continuing explosions at the Stade de France and shootings in restaurants across the city. Parisians realized that this was not an isolated attack, but a coordinated assault aimed to terrorize the entire nation. Authorities quickly moved to contain the situation, but the sheer scale of the attacks overwhelmed even the best-prepared emergency responders. Inside the Bataclan, time seemed suspended. The gunmen shouted in Arabic, demanding that hostages lie still, threatening anyone who moved. The cries of wounded and terrified concertgoers created a chaotic symphony of horror. Some survivors later described the surreal feeling of seeing young people, friends and strangers fall beside them, blood staining the stage and the floor beneath their feet. A young man lay next to a friend, holding his hand as life slipped away, the terror of the moment etched into memory for those who survived. Others whispered prayers, clinging to faith as bullets tore through the venue, hoping to somehow make it through the night alive. As the minutes dragged on, the attackers forced some hostages into corners, making them kneel as threats were issued, while others lay motionless, pretending to be dead. The world outside had begun to piece together the horrifying reality. This was not just a shooting, but a massacre intended to terrorize the global stage. The coordination of multiple attacks, timed almost simultaneously, suggested careful planning, and the involvement of an organization that had studied Paris meticulously. Analysts would later conclude that the Bataclan was selected not only for its capacity, but also for its symbolic value, a center of culture and music, a place representing life, joy, and community, now targeted for destruction. Emergency services attempted to reach the scene, but the chaotic streets, clogged with panicked citizens and emergency vehicles, slowed their advance. Officers on foot tried to evacuate those who had managed to escape, while the sounds of gunfire continued inside. Negotiators and SWAT teams began planning their response, aware that any misstep could cost more lives. Meanwhile, families of concertgoers sat at home or in nearby streets, unable to reach their loved ones, watching the unfolding horror on live television. The air was thick with fear, grief, and uncertainty, as Paris realized the scale of the terror that had descended upon it. Inside, the tension escalated as the attackers began moving from one section of the hall to another, ensuring that no one could hide safely. The screams, cries, and gunfire seemed endless, an unrelenting wave of violence that tested the resolve of everyone trapped. Some survivors later recounted the small, desperate acts of courage, the helping of strangers, the silent encouragement to remain still, the fleeting moments of human connection in the face of unimaginable horror. Each second was a life and death struggle, every movement potentially fatal, as the gunmen maintained complete control over the hall. As the night dragged on, the first hints of police intervention appeared. Units gathered outside, coordinating their strategy for storming the venue while attempting to maintain safety for those still inside. The world held its breath as media coverage broadcast live updates, viewers around the globe horrified at the images of chaos, emergency vehicles, and terrified citizens. The stakes were clear. Time was running out for those trapped inside the Bataclan, and every decision made by law enforcement, every second delayed, could mean the difference between life and death. The Bataclan became the centerpiece of an unimaginable tragedy, a horrifying demonstration of calculated violence that tore through innocent lives with devastating efficiency. Each moment inside the venue was an ordeal, a test of courage and endurance as the world outside scrambled to comprehend the scale of the attacks. Paris, a city renowned for art, culture, and light, was now shrouded in darkness, its people forced to confront an evil that arrived not with warning but with precision, leaving scars that would never fully heal and questions that would haunt the city and the world long after the gunfire finally ceased. Outside the Bataclan, the streets of Paris were filled with sirens, flashing lights, and an overwhelming sense of panic. Emergency vehicles struggled to navigate the chaos, weaving through crowds of terrified citizens who had fled from nearby restaurants, cafes, and bars. The city, normally vibrant and alive, had been transformed into a war zone. Families clutched each other, neighbors helped strangers, and witnesses shared frantic phone calls trying to locate loved ones, all while the sounds of gunfire and explosions echoed through the streets. The initial shock had transformed into fear, a pervasive dread that settled over every corner of the city. For the police and emergency responders, the night was a test of endurance, strategy, and courage as they attempted to respond to multiple attacks simultaneously. Inside the Bataclan, the situation had reached its most horrifying point. The gunmen moved methodically, checking corners, forcing hostages to the floor, and shouting orders to maintain control. Their aim was not just to kill but to terrorize, to make a statement that would send ripples across the world. Those trapped inside faced unimaginable choices: to move and risk death, to stay hidden and pray for survival, or to attempt an escape through doors guarded by armed attackers. Many later recounted the surreal moments of hearing someone fall beside them, the faint moans of injured strangers, and the absolute terror of knowing there was nowhere truly safe. The floor was slick with blood, the smell of gunpowder and fear hanging thick in the air, and every second stretched into what felt like an eternity. Outside, French authorities coordinated a massive response. Units from across the city were mobilized, establishing perimeters and planning entry points. Negotiators tried to communicate with the attackers, urging them to release hostages and surrender. Meanwhile, citizens kept their distance, their hearts pounding as they watched SWAT teams prepare for the assault. The tense standoff highlighted the complexity of responding to a situation that combined multiple acts of terrorism with the imminent risk to hundreds of innocent lives. Every movement outside was mirrored by the deadly precision inside, creating a deadly chess game where one wrong decision could lead to further loss of life. Back inside, some hostages found brief moments of courage. Groups huddled together, whispering plans for survival, holding each other upright in the midst of chaos. Others prayed quietly, hoping that divine intervention would somehow spare them from the bullets that tore through the room. The gunmen, however, were relentless, moving from one section of the hall to another, ensuring control and maintaining terror. Survivors later described the eerie calm of the attackers between bursts of gunfire, their movements deliberate, almost mechanical, as they executed their horrific plan. Time lost all meaning, measured only in the sounds of gunfire, screams, and the occasional shout from law enforcement outside. Meanwhile, the city of Paris tried to process what was happening. Social media exploded with messages from witnesses. News outlets scrambled to verify the attacks, and emergency hotlines were inundated with calls. People who had loved ones inside the Bataclan or nearby attack zones were desperate for information, clinging to hope amid a tidal wave of fear and uncertainty. Hospitals began preparing for mass casualties, doctors and nurses bracing for a surge of wounded citizens. Across the city, ordinary Parisians were forced to confront the reality of a coordinated attack, the scale of which shook even the most prepared minds. As hours passed, police forces outside prepared for a decisive intervention. Teams assessed the structure, determined potential entry points, and prepared to neutralize the attackers while minimizing risk to hostages. The challenge was immense. A direct assault could trigger the killers to execute more hostages, while hesitation prolonged the suffering of those trapped inside. Negotiators continued attempts at communication, but the attackers were unyielding, committed to their violent mission. Inside, hostages continued to live in terror, some forced to witness the deaths of others, their own survival hanging by fragile thread. Every heartbeat became a test of endurance, every breath a fragile promise of life. The surrounding streets were filled with both fear and solidarity. Citizens formed human chains, directing survivors away from danger, offering blankets and comfort to those who had escaped. The city had become a mixture of panic, chaos, and heroism, as ordinary people stepped into extraordinary roles to help protect each other. Emergency services coordinated with volunteers and locals, creating temporary triage stations for those injured outside the hall. And the media broadcast live updates, showing a city on edge, a nation in shock. Inside the Bataclan, moments of survival were punctuated by acts of courage and resilience. Some hostages found courage in each other, forming small groups that supported the wounded and whispered encouragement, their bonds forged in the crucible of terror. Others attempted daring escapes, slipping past attackers and diving through windows or doors whenever a fleeting opportunity appeared. The gunmen, however, remained focused, their control unbroken, their mission clear. The scene inside was a stark contrast to the solidarity forming outside. Inside was chaos and fear. Outside was strategy and hope, yet both were inseparably linked by the urgency to end the night's horror. Finally, after hours of terror, authorities decided to act. The assault on the Bataclan was imminent. Teams entered strategically, moving with precision to neutralize the attackers and rescue the hostages. The sound of coordinated gunfire inside clashed with the chaos outside, creating an overwhelming cacophony of violence. Inside, hostages were guided towards safety when possible, while law enforcement engaged the attackers directly. Each moment was fraught with danger, every decision potentially fatal. The world watched in horror and disbelief as Paris confronted the unimaginable reality that had unfolded within its streets, its cafes, and its concert halls, understanding that even in a city of light and culture, darkness could descend with terrifying force. The aftermath of the Paris attacks was a scene of unimaginable devastation, a city forever scarred by the horrors that had unfolded over those fateful hours. Streets once bustling with life were now filled with police tape, emergency vehicles, and crowds of stunned citizens trying to comprehend what had happened. Candles flickered on sidewalks, flowers were laid at makeshift memorials, and photos of the victims were held aloft by family members and strangers alike. The human toll was staggering: 130 lives lost, hundreds more wounded, families torn apart, and a nation plunged into grief. Paris, a city renowned for its beauty, culture, and resilience, had been shaken to its core, and the collective trauma would linger for years to come. The global reaction was immediate and profound. Messages of solidarity poured in from every corner of the world. Leaders condemned the attacks, and citizens everywhere expressed their horror at the scale and coordination of the violence. Social media became a platform for mourning and sharing information, with hashtags calling for peace and unity trending worldwide. Images of the Bataclan, the cafes, and the stadium circulated endlessly, each one a stark reminder of the human cost of terrorism. The attacks had not only devastated Paris, but had sent a message of fear across Europe and the world, showing that no city, no matter how cherished, was immune to the threat of violence. Investigations began almost immediately, as French authorities, intelligence agencies, and international partners worked tirelessly to track down the perpetrators and their networks. It became clear that ISIS was behind the coordinated assaults, having meticulously planned each attack to inflict maximum terror and media attention. The attackers had trained abroad, communicated through encrypted channels, and carried out reconnaissance to ensure precision in their horrifying mission. The revelation sent shockwaves through security services worldwide, highlighting vulnerabilities even in cities considered well protected and raising urgent questions about how to prevent such tragedies in the future. Survivors of the Bataclan, the cafes, and the stadium carried with them scars that could never be erased. Many recounted the indescribable fear of being trapped, the helplessness of seeing friends and strangers killed before their eyes, and the sheer will to survive despite the chaos surrounding them. Support networks, including counseling and community programs, were mobilized to help victims and their families process the trauma. Acts of heroism emerged amid the horror, with stories of ordinary citizens saving strangers, first responders risking their lives repeatedly, and musicians comforting survivors even in the darkest moments. These stories, though overshadowed by the scale of tragedy, offered glimmers of humanity in a night dominated by evil. In the days following the attacks, France declared a state of emergency, placing security forces on high alert across the nation. Streets were patrolled with increased vigilance, airports and public transportation were monitored more closely, and intelligence operations intensified to prevent any further attacks. Citizens were asked to remain vigilant, and a sense of tension lingered even as life slowly attempted to return to normal. The cultural heart of Paris, the theaters, cafes, concert halls, and sports arenas reopened with heavy security, yet the memory of that night was impossible to ignore. The city moved forward, but the shadow of fear lingered, and the grief of those who lost loved ones could never be fully healed. Globally, the attacks sparked discussions about terrorism, radicalization, and the balance between security and personal freedoms. Governments reevaluated intelligence sharing, border control, and counter-terrorism measures, understanding that coordinated assaults on civilian populations could have devastating consequences. Academics, policymakers, and analysts studied the attacks, looking for patterns and strategies to prevent future tragedies. But the unpredictability and extremity of the Bataclan massacre and the simultaneous assaults posed questions that were difficult to answer fully. For the people of Paris, life after the attacks became a complex mixture of mourning, resilience, and defiance. Vigils were held every week in memory of the victims, and the city collectively mourned as a symbol of unity. Citizens refused to surrender their streets, their cafes, or their music halls to fear. Music returned to the Bataclan, this time in tribute, as performers honored those who had been killed while refusing to let terror silence the city's heartbeat. Memorials grew, both physical and digital, where stories of the lost were shared, their lives remembered, and their dreams honored. Paris became a city that both grieved and resisted, showing the world that even in the wake of profound tragedy, life and hope could endure. The Paris attacks of 2015 were more than a national tragedy. They were a global shockwave. They demonstrated the capacity for organized violence to strike without warning, yet they also revealed the strength of communities, first responders, and ordinary citizens in the face of evil. The horror of that night would never be forgotten, etched into the history of Paris and the memories of those who survived. It became a symbol of the fragility of safety, the unpredictability of terror, and the enduring need for vigilance and compassion in the modern world. Ultimately, the legacy of the attacks is twofold. On one hand, it is a reminder of the vulnerability of human life and the cruelty that can be inflicted by those driven by extremist ideology. On the other, it is a testament to resilience, the courage of survivors, the solidarity of communities, and the refusal of a city and a nation to be broken by fear. Paris, in its grieving and its resistance, continues to stand as a beacon of both sorrow and strength. The events of November 13, 2015, remain a haunting chapter in modern history, a story of unimaginable loss, profound courage, and the enduring spirit of humanity that refuses to be silenced even by the darkest of nights. The city of Paris, forever changed, still shines as a reminder that even in the face of terror, life, hope, and resilience can endure, and that the memory of those lost will forever inspire courage against the shadows that threaten humanity.